Good morning. I'm very grateful in what I consider to be my safe space. You see, I've spent most of my life in rather hostile environments. First, I was raised in left-wing Vermont, an American state that gave the world Bernie Sanders. I attended an American university where conservatives were seen as what? Fascists. And in my 15 years in Europe, during which I spent some time in the UK, I found that the UK was hardly a welcoming place for conservative Christians. So thank you for indulging me. I'm going to start by simply saying something that most of you know, nothing controversial here. Christendom is under attack from threats both external and internal. Now, there's no need for me to catalog those threats. Other people have done that before me. But aggressive secularism is one of them. Whether it's the militantly secular state or a barren cultural landscape, the Christian faith struggles to survive. And too often, when the faithful try to live in accordance with their beliefs, they're trampled by an intrusive and unforgiving politically correct culture that mistakes religious faith for intolerance and then seeks vengeance in the name of some progressive justice. Now, the situation is, in part, the outcome of centuries and centuries of explicitly anti-Christian philosophies. But there's also been a dramatic global cultural revolution, which has affected all aspects of life and has led to the deconstruction of what some call the Judeo-Christian anthropology. I'm sorry to say that this revolution has been facilitated, supported by people like us, the media, many of whom naively believe in the myth of a value-free or objective journalism. And in doing so, they've sought to roll back the influence of Christianity in the public square. But it hasn't stopped there. Journalists have sometimes worked in collusion with government agencies to attack Christian groups and even fellow communicators. Here's just one recent example. A gentleman called Neil Datta, D-A-T-T-A, is the secretary of the European Parliamentary Forum on Population and Development, EPF. In April of 2018, he used his position and presumably the public resources at his disposal to publish an official but alarmist report on a European network of like-minded Christian communicators, lawyers, and thinkers. Full disclosure, I am a member of that loose association. It's really just a listserv of 300 people. And all we do is share links to news stories, job openings, information, and data. Nothing fancy, certainly nothing sinister. But Mr. Datta saw something more behind it. So his report, which was based on documents stolen from a hacked computer in Spain, issued this report titling it, "The Religious Extremists' Vision to Mobilize European Societies Against Human Rights." It was posted on the EPF website and then was rapidly picked up by sympathetic media. Once the media cycle went through its cycle, it was picked up again by another group of sympathetic media outlets. Then earlier this year, the same story in the report was rehashed and issued again over a series of days by several closely linked media outlets. It was clearly, I suggest, a well-coordinated effort. Another example, more recently, the New York Times reported on the, quote, global machine fueling anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe. They alleged that shady, well-funded racists were facilitating the creation of anti-immigration and conservative Christian news portals across Europe. But at the same time, they ignored completely any of the plausible reasons why anybody would resist open immigration. They didn't even bother exploring that. So like so many others, the Times only seems to focus on groups that are either explicitly religious or right of center. Sadly, this is not the only way Christians are attacked. Do you know what doxing is? I wonder how many of you do. In the good old days, if you wrote an article or broadcast something that people didn't like, you would get a nasty letter to the editor. Today you get doxed, D-O-X-X-E-D. This is when someone anonymously publishes private information about you online. Your home address, your telephone number, your wife's name, where she works, the name of your children. It typically happens because either you were too conservative in your opinions, or too Christian in your coverage, or because, more likely, you simply failed to follow the liberal orthodoxy. These kinds of malicious attacks and actions are fundamentally motivated by a hatred of our culture, our civilization. They're serious attacks on who we are, and I think they merit a strong response from Christian journalists. But for this to happen, you need to be the right kind of journalist, the right kind of person. Who is the right kind of journalist? Let me tell you about one I used to know. Now, you might not know it from my name, but I am half Bolivian. And growing up, my hero was my grandfather. We called him Abuelito Jimmy, Abuelito being grandfather, Jimmy, his nickname. I loved him. He was a model of good behavior, a devoted husband, loving father, very playful, a lot of practical jokes. But he had a long diplomatic career first. One of his first missions, in fact, in the late 1930s was to Rome, to the Holy See. In everything my grandfather did as a diplomat, he brought to bear a very clear understanding of Christian ethics, keeping his hands clean and avoiding even the mere appearance of impropriety. Now, as much as he loved diplomacy, he had a greater love, besides my grandmother, which was journalism, the written word. And he worked as an editor, a columnist, a magazine publisher, and there too, in everything he did, he brought to bear a very clear sense of ethics. His integrity shone like a beacon, kind of like that light shining in my eyes. For our conversation here today, my conversation, the thing I want to share with you is his belief in the vocation to be a journalist, the vocation to be a man of letters. Now, I know this is a rather old-fashioned way of thinking about journalists as men of letters. But George William Rutler, a famed American priest, notes that you have to go back about 100 years to the time of G.K. Chesterton to find such an understanding of journalists. He writes, quote, "The journalist of Chesterton's vintage, 1890s, 1920s, was still then a man of letters." My grandfather, too, was one of those, and he believed that journalists, men of letters, ought to serve society. They thus had a function to be teachers, educators, catechists. Their responsibility was not only to report, but to communicate, above all, moral lessons. Now, I know that might sound a bit odd, too, a bit overly grandiose, but it's only because we've lost that understanding. I think it's high time we recuperate that understanding of journalism and what it means to be a journalist. But this requires that we also restore our understanding of the written word, of the act of writing, of the importance of literature. Words teach people, they impart knowledge, yes, but the right words transmit truth. My grandfather understood all this very well, and it informed his understanding of what he called the ethics of journalism. So I'll say a few words about that. For him, the ethics of journalism could be broken down into three key objectives: reality and truth, reintegration, and justice. I'll explain each of these just a little bit. Reality and truth. I realize in a world of fake news, to speak of reality and truth means very little. In fact, people often insist that there are multiple realities, not one, and that truth is whatever I say it is on a given day. This is all rather amusing, of course, because often the same people who insist that there is no monolithic truth or reality are the same people who then argue, well, we need a return to objective and true journalism. Clearly a contradiction. For Christian journalists, having reality and truth as objectives means seeking the truth in all things, upholding the truth. And it's not just the truth of the story. Did that CEO embezzle $500 million? It's not just about that. It's also the truth of our world, communicating the truth of our world, the reality of a fallen man in a divinely created world. In contrast to my grandfather's idea of truth, the secular mainstream media today wants everyone to accept a variety of falsehoods, both in their reporting and in their work. Just consider some of the lies that are typically pushed by today's secular journalists. That there are 63 genders, not 2. That love makes a family, not a man and a woman. And that abortion, it's not murder. It's free choice of a woman. And that somehow those who don't believe in those lies are fascists. Of course, the denial of reality and the purposeful distortion of the truth is nothing new, right? It goes back to the days of our Lord. What did Pontius Pilate ask? Quid est veritas? Sadly, today, no one even cares to even pose that question. Tells you how much or how far we've fallen. I think my grandfather, already in the 1950s, could see the handwriting on the wall, and hence his emphasis on reality and truth as one of those key objectives of his ethics of journalism. His second objective was reintegration. Reintegration of what? Of man into the created order. Reintegration has to do with the fundamental task of the man of letters. As Richard Weaver, the American scholar of rhetoric, used to teach in Chicago, the art of communication always promotes some sort of value system, whether we realize it or not. Our language, Weaver wrote, quote, is never innocent of intention, but always has as its object exerting of some kind of compulsion, end quote. In other words, the challenge of those working with the written word is not to try to make things purely objective or value-free, but rather making sure that the values that are being transmitted in whatever is being written are the right ones, sound, moral, and rooted in the divine. Contrast this with the secular journalist in the West today, who is an apologist for the worship of the self, a mouthpiece for the transient values of pop culture. And because our cultural and managerial elites share this same impoverished secular vision of man in society, the secular journalist becomes their propagandist. As Christian journalists, we have to combat this with our writings, with our words, and thereby contribute to the reintegration of the human being into the divine order. Quite a task, kind of daunting. I know to us moderns it sounds implausible and impossible perhaps, but for over a century, those in our profession used to understand much of this. Journalists, writers, men of letters used to understand that they were all part of the same project, to rehabilitate man and help him achieve communion with the divine order. This is the reintegration that my grandfather thought should also be at the heart of the ethics of journalism. The third and final objective, I said, was justice. So in today's world, with the rise of the social justice warriors and their monopoly on the very idea of justice, we can scarcely talk about justice. In the US, they speak of economic justice achieved through the policies proposed by people like Bernie Sanders. Their analogs in Europe, in turn, speak of migrant justice and of the justice of allowing in anyone and everybody who wants to come to Europe. Needless to say, these are not examples of the justice my grandfather talked about. They're examples of a left-wing political agenda that uses political rhetoric and imagined injustices to camouflage its objectives. Let me tell you what real injustices look like to us Christians. It's not justice when journalists do not investigate the commercial activities of a foreign entity well known for espionage, repression, religious persecution, thought control, and ruthless punishment of its enemies. So when journalists give China a pass on its nefarious activities, that is not justice. It's not justice when journalists do not investigate the jail time privileges and the mysterious suicide of a wealthy, powerful man known to have facilitated sexual encounters between children and some of the world's most powerful men. So when journalists do not investigate the sordid life and death of Jeffrey Epstein, that is not justice. And it's not justice when the media labels today's populist or nationalist movements with terms like racist, extremists, fascists, xenophobes, instead of learning more about the frustrations of their supporters. So when journalists dismissively portray supporters of Salvini, Trump, Bolsonaro, or even Brexit as ignorant, uneducated hoi polloi, that's not justice either. Reality and truth, reintegration of the human being, justice, none of these mean anything if there's no understanding of Christianity, if they're not rooted in a Christian terrain. And this is precisely why the work of Christian journalists is so important. We have, like all other Christians, the duty, the divine commission to teach the truth and to inform the public of the right order of things. So now what? I've outlined a laundry list of challenges and threats. I've offered up some key objectives for an ethics of journalism. But now in my remaining minutes, I'd like to consider some actions, things that we as Christian journalists and communicators can do. These range from emulating models to changing the way we ourselves behave. I see these as tools in our arsenal for the reconstruction of the Christian West. So first, a critical first step is to know and then defend our identity. This must be a starting point. We need a robust and multi-platform defense of European civilization, of Western civilization, of Christendom, whatever you want to call it, and journalists have a key role to play in this. I recognize that to speak of identity is fraught with problems. Our modern culture demands that statements about identity be phrased using sensitive, inclusive, and progressive jargon, but we can and should speak confidently and proudly of our Western inheritance and our Judeo-Christian identity. Let's remind others that we are the inheritors of an intricate cultural and religious tapestry. I love that image. It's a tapestry that begins in the ancient Near East, continues through classical antiquity, and reaches its apotheosis with Hellenized Christianity. It's also worth reminding others that only a civilization rooted in Christianity and its sacraments could ever embrace, respect, tolerate, and defend the rights of others, including non-Christians. Only in a civilization in which there is a religion that teaches us to love one another rather than fear each other or submit blindly to an unknown, an unknowable God, can the principles we cherish survive. This is part of our identity. Second, we need to renew and expand what I like to call our cultural infrastructure. In today's world, I'd even call it an infrastructure of resistance. This requires that we do more as communicators and media entrepreneurs. We need to start new initiatives, launch new projects, new magazines, new publishing houses, find new and innovative ways to reach more and more people. There are already signs that such things are happening. Here's a few encouraging examples. In France, the emergence of La Manif pour Tout movement a few years ago in support of traditional families, something an observer called May 1968 in reverse, was complemented and supported by a constellation of online Christian publications, blogs, and other media, and it worked rather well. In Italy, the mobilization efforts and publishing work of Nazione Futura and the revamped efforts of the more established Alleanza Cattolica have demonstrated that despite the dominance of a small group of political and economic elites, efforts that focus on the cultural and the spiritual can still reach citizens and make an impact. Here in Hungary, the existence of alternative media initiatives is also part of this emerging infrastructure of resistance. Think of things like Mandiner or the journal Kommentar. These are excellent examples. What these and other initiatives are doing is contributing to the expansion of what some call the intellectual dark web, IDW. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term. It was coined by the managing director of Thiel Capital, Eric Weinstein. The intellectual dark web refers to all those public personalities who oppose the dominance of political correctness and progressive politics in the media and in the academy. Some of those who already form part of this loose, informal network of heretics include Ben Shapiro, Douglas Murray, author of The Strange Death of Europe, Jordan Peterson, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the Dutch critic of Islam. We should also be part of this intellectual dark web. Third, we should emulate the moral courage and leadership of others. Now, our host here during these 3 days is a perfect example. Beginning with the Easter Constitution of 2011, which put God back into the preamble, Hungary has rescued its national traditions and culture from the dustbin. In addition, its public policies are oriented toward the good, toward right order. Think of how it supports religious freedom through its Ministry of Human Capacities, or with the highly regarded Hungary Helps Agency, which assists Christians in and out of Europe. And Hungary has also put the family back at the center of the constitutional order. Think of the work of the Ministry of State for Family and Youth Affairs. Lest any of you think I'm only saying this because I'm here in front of some Hungarian patriots, I point out that I have long been an admirer of all things Hungarian, and every time I visit, I'm blessed in one way or another. This time, the blessing was twofold. For I arrived on Monday for the commemoration of 330 years since the siege of Buda, and that evening was also the glorious feast of St. Stephen of Hungary, one of the most outstanding of Catholic monarchs. This small country, so maligned by the secular media, has thus shown exceptional leadership and demonstrated moral courage by resisting the transnational progressive push to redefine the family and by supporting and fomenting the creation of alternative media. This should inspire many others. Finally, perhaps most importantly, we must sanctify our everyday, ordinary lives. We cannot hope for a renewed Christendom without a re-Christianization of the West, which must begin with ourselves. We need to integrate all the ordinary dimensions of our lives, our work and our activities, our social relationships, with the supernatural. We thus must seek to set our hearts on fire and reorient everything we do towards otherworldly ends. In everything we do, and this holds true for all communicators as well as everybody else, we are commanded to do things with charity, with magnanimity, with humility, and with thanks to God for everything we are and everything we do. We should also be joyful, which means we should write good stories about good things, and we should act as leaven in the bread, raising up our societies and our communities. It also means we have to display courage in everything we do, guided by faith, the courage, especially, to reveal to others that you are indeed a follower of Jesus Christ. Without these efforts at personal sanctity, a renewed Christendom for the 21st century will remain elusive. So while our success depends on how assiduously we reclaim our identity and how lovingly we rebuild the ancient ruins of Western civilization, we also need to take a heroic stand against our dominant culture, and perhaps even the sacrifice that martyrs are called to make. Thank you.